Hi, welcome to Give Me the Bible, where God's Word speaks for itself. We're going to be in Romans 11 verse 7 through 16. And I realize it's been a while since I've made a video. My headaches have really been flaring up on me. Migraines literally 24 hours a day. I have a headache. From the time I wake up in the morning to the time I wake up the next morning, I have a headache. It's insane and it varies in intensity. So I continue to ask for your prayers on my behalf and for your patience and your mercy and grace and understanding. When I've got these headaches, sometimes I just have to be like a computer and go into safe mode and just shut down, all kind of extra applications going on and only focus on the bare minimum of what I need to get done in terms of my sermons, my Bible classes, and the YouTube. Unfortunately, is kind of a bonus thing that I just have to walk away from when I'm struggling so much. So today's a decent day, and so I want to make sure to get this content to you from Romans 11, 7 through 16. Remember, in this chapter, Paul is kind of shifting his focus away from the Jews and toward the Gentiles. It's based on the similar issue of God's relationship with the Jews, but he's really shifting his focus toward the Gentiles because they might be tempted to be arrogant against the Jews who are lost. They might think, oh, well, God, he must be done with the Jewish people. He must be completely done with the Jews. They're no longer his special chosen people, but we Gentiles, we're the special ones now under Jesus. And Paul's just not having any of that. He started, remember from our last video in verses 1 through 6, saying, no, God is not done with Israel. He still has a faithful remnant. If they'll just turn to Jesus, they can be saved too. That's really been the tenor throughout chapters 9 through 11 is, yes, it is sad that many Jews will be lost, but they don't have to be. If they'll just turn and put their faith in Jesus, be baptized into the Lord, they can be forgiven, they can be saved. So he picks up on this conversation in verse 7. He says, what then? What Israel is seeking, it has not obtained, but those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. Just as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not, down to this very day. So here we have this language being brought up again from chapter 9 about the concept of being chosen or being hardened. And remember, God always gets to choose who the inheritors of the Abrahamic promises are. That was true in the Old Testament. It's true now in the New. And the ones that God chooses to be inheritors of the new covenant promises are those who put their faith in Jesus. But those who reject Jesus, God hardens them as punishment. Remember, to harden people is to solidify them in their current condition. So we have to be sure we understand this. It's not that a lot of these Jews, they just really wanted to come to Jesus. They wanted to put their faith in him, but God hardened them, and so they couldn't. And God is the one keeping them from being saved. No, it's their own rebellion against Jesus that brings down God's punishment, in which he hardens them in their condition and then uses them to accomplish his purposes. He did that to Pharaoh. Back in chapter 9, we talked about that. He's also doing that with the Jews. First, he hardened the Jews so they put Jesus on the cross to bring salvation to the world. Well, now he's hardening the Jews in this text to bring salvation to the Gentiles, so that the salvation of the Gentiles could be used to bring about the salvation of more Jews. So we'll talk about that in a second. But let's make sure we understand what's happening here. In verse 8, he quotes from a couple different places, from Deuteronomy 29 and Isaiah 29. And it was a rabbinic practice commonly, if you had two passages from the Old Testament that were similar, to just combine them and almost make it sound like it's the same verse. So it sounds like he's quoting one verse here, but he's actually grabbing themes and concepts from Deuteronomy 29 and Isaiah 29. If you look with me there real quick in Deuteronomy 29, remember Moses there, he's talking to the second generation of Israel because the first generation died in the wilderness. And the second generation is getting ready to go into the land. And then look what Moses says to them in verse 4. He says, yet to this day, the Lord has not given you a heart to know, nor eyes to see, nor ears to hear. So Moses says, up to this point, God hasn't really given you spiritual understanding, who he is and what he's all about and what he really wants from his people. He's not given them that deep spiritual understanding that they need. Why? Because of their unbelief. That first generation had unbelieving hearts. And so God hardened them in a sense. He blinded their eyes to the truth about who he is and instead hardened them, and they ended up being punished by wandering in the wilderness for 40 years until they died. But now the question is, Moses is talking to the second generation here. So is this really fair for God to also close the eyes and the ears of this second generation? Yes, because they too are going to have the same unbelieving hearts as the previous generation. Oh yeah, they'll get a little bit further. They'll definitely get into the promised land, but they're going to break God's covenant too. And in fact, the rest of Deuteronomy 29, Moses says, you guys are going to break God's covenant, and God's going to have to punish you by sending you to a foreign nation. Look in chapter 31 of Deuteronomy, verse 16. He says, verse 16, 31, chapter 31, verse 16, the Lord said to Moses, behold, you're about to lie down with your fathers, and this people will arise and play the harlot with strange gods of the land into the midst of which they are going, and will forsake me and break my covenant which I have made with them. God knows this people, they're going to have the same hard hearts as the previous generation, so he's going to harden them as well. Look in Isaiah 29. This will give us an even clearer picture of why God hardens his people. In Isaiah, Israelites, they're trusting in idols. They're trusting in foreign alliances with these nations, these Gentile pagan nations around them, instead of trusting in God. And so God tells them in Isaiah 29:10, the Lord has poured over you a spirit of deep sleep. He has shut your eyes, the prophets, and he has covered your heads, the seers. The entire vision will be to you like the words of a sealed book, which when they give it to the one who is literate, saying, please read this, he will say, I cannot read, for it is sealed. Why is God kind of shutting the eyes of his people here, hardening them? Well, verse 13 tells us, then the Lord said, because this people draw near with their words and honor me with their lip service, but they remove their hearts far from me, and their reverence for me consists of tradition learned by rote. Now you might recognize that from something Jesus said to the Pharisees. He quoted this, applied it to the Pharisees. And the reason God hardened their hearts is because their hearts were far from God. And that's exactly what's going on in Romans chapter 11. These Jews who are rejecting Jesus, they honor God with their lips. They say, we're God's chosen people. We are the inheritors of the Abrahamic promises, but their hearts are far from God. Their hearts are so far from God, they put his son on a cross and murdered him. Look now in Romans 11. Let's continue. Verse 9 and 10, David says, let their table become a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened to see not and bend their backs forever. So we won't go back and take the time to look through Psalm 69. I do encourage you to read that whole psalm. It's amazing because that's a psalm from David, the chosen king of God. He is supposed to be this ideal king who would come and bring blessings to his people. But unfortunately, many of his people reject him, and they hate him, and they try to kill him. And so as a result, David prays this, it's called an imprecatory prayer. It's where you call down God to bring justice on his enemies, to bring vengeance on his enemies. And this is what David is doing. And when you think about it, this is the perfect passage to cite here, because Jesus is the ultimate king. He is the true Davidic king, the descendant of David, who would be the ideal Messiah to bring blessings to his people. But the Jews, at the time Paul's writing this, they're rejecting Jesus, just like the Jews rejected David back then. And so it should be no surprise then that God would carry out vengeance by bringing judgment on them for it. So once again, none of this is God's fault. The fact that the Jews are lost is not because God is unfaithful, it's because the Jews are being unfaithful to God and to his Messiah. And so God hardens them to use them for his purposes and to punish them for their disobedience and their rebellion. Let's continue though, because there is a note of hope. Verse 11, I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be, but by their transgressions salvation has come to the Gentiles, to make them jealous. So Paul says there's still hope. The Jews, they've stumbled over Jesus. He says in 1 Corinthians, Jesus is a stumbling block to the Jews, right? So they're having a hard time believing him, but it doesn't mean that they've fallen permanently and that they can't get up and change their minds and come back to Jesus. But in the meantime, God actually used their rejection to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. So that now when the Gentiles are saved, the Jews will look on the Gentiles with jealousy and say, hey, they're worshiping our Messiah. That's our Davidic king. They're being blessed and enjoying all this amazing, spiritual community in the church, and we're missing out on this, and we want in on that. So it's just amazing that God actually is bringing good out of the evil of the Jews. He's taking the evil rejection of Jesus by the Jews to turn it into something good, to bring salvation to the Gentiles, and then ultimately to make Jews jealous so that they too will come and be saved as well. Continue, verse 12, now if their transgression is riches for the world, and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? A good way to summarize this is, if God can bring good out of their evil rejection, how much more good can God bring from their obedient faith? If the Jews turn around and actually start doing God's will, how much greater will that be? How much greater good can God do once they turn and come back to him? Verse 13, but I am speaking to you who are Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle of Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them. So again, here Paul, he's really focusing on the Gentiles, making sure that they are not arrogant against the Jews and thinking, we are now God's special people. God doesn't even like the Jews anymore. He's just written them off completely. Paul's saying that's not true. In fact, Paul says, the reason I celebrate or magnify my ministry to the Gentiles is because of what it's going to do for many of the Jews. It's going to make them jealous so that they will come and put their faith in Jesus as well. So it's interesting, Paul doesn't say, well, I magnify and I celebrate my ministry to the Gentiles because the Gentiles are just so much better and I'm sick of the Jews anyway. No. It's so that more Jews can eventually come to faith. Verse 15. And really, verse 15 is kind of a restatement of verse 12. Very similar. He says, for if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If God could use their rejection to bring about reconciliation among the pagan, the Gentile world, then how much greater will it be for the Jews to come back to the Lord? It would be like a resurrection from the dead. It would just be this amazing thing that can happen in the future. And in verse 16, if the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also. And if the root is holy, the branches are too. So this draws on imagery from Numbers chapter 15, when the Israelites would bring in the first fruits of their harvest. Anytime they had the first fruits of their harvest, that was dedicated to God. They would recognize God is the one who provided us with our crops, and so we're thankful to him. And let's just say, I'm just drawing this out, I have no idea how big a piece of dough it would be from their first fruits. But let's say they harvest their first fruits and they make this big, giant piece of dough. Interestingly, Numbers 15 doesn't say that you have to give this, entire huge piece of dough to the Lord. It says you just take a lump from that piece. You make that lump into a cake, you give that to the priest, and that is your offering to the Lord. So you can kind of see the imagery. That whole first piece of dough is really holy and dedicated to God because this is the first fruits. But there's just one particular lump that you actually have to give to God as an offering. So probably what Paul's doing here is he's drawing a parallel between that first piece of dough and the initial Israelites in the Old Testament who were faithful to God. People like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, right? David. You could just continue listing Elijah, all these Jews who were truly Jews from the heart. All of those who were truly Israel. Remember in chapter 9, verse 6, he says, not all Israel are of Israel. In other words, not all who are physical Israelites are actually Israelites in their heart. But what Paul's saying is actually all of those first Israelites who really gave their hearts to God back in the Old Testament, they're like that first piece of dough. And maybe even that includes all the Jews up to the point where Paul is writing Romans. All the faithful Jews so far in the new covenant. They're part of that first piece of dough. That's all holy to the Lord. Now, if a lump comes from that later on by more faithful Jews putting their faith in Jesus, well, that lump is holy too. So he's looking forward to more Jews in the future who will put their faith in God, just like the original Israelites in the Old Testament who put their faith in God, and even many of the Israelites, the ethnic Jews, who are putting their faith in Jesus now in the New Testament. Whatever Jews come in the future, they'll be like that lump taken from that big, holy first piece of dough. He makes the same point, but he uses different imagery. In the second part, he says, if the root is holy, the branches are too. Again, the root, all the faithful of Israel in the past, in the Old Testament, and even up to this point in the New Covenant, that's the root, and that's holy to God. And so any branches that come from that root, that come from that tree, are also going to be holy as well. That means, again, the picture is consistent in Romans 9 through 11. There's hope for Jewish people. They can be saved. They can become a part of that original tree. They can be like that original first piece of dough that was holy to the Lord as well if they'll just put their faith in Jesus. This isn't God's fault if Jews are lost. If Jews are lost, it's their fault for not putting their faith in Jesus. I hope that message is clear. Paul just hammers on that same point over and over again, just in different ways. And I hope that is clear and helpful to you. Lord willing, I'll see you next time.